Hello there. Today I shall be making another video. Now, apologies for not making one yesterday. I forgot and I was tired, so I failed to. So today I'll make two, and even though it's late, this should hopefully be quick. So let's talk about warfare in the past. See, a lot of people, when they hear about war and things done during it, they often find it surprising or even treat it as if it's such a horrible thing. For example, the US during Iraq engaged in practices of torture. For a lot of people, that's a bad thing. Compared to the past, even recently, frankly, they showed more mercy than quite a few people would. See, war is dumbed down today. And when I say dumbed down, I mean restrained. A lot of things that we take for granted, like for example the Geneva Conventions and other rules regarding warfare and how people engage with their enemy, did not exist. There's a reason things like chivalry existed as an honor code. It was to try to basically balance out the cruelty of war by saying, alright, you, my knight, are a very valuable person. So, do this, this, and this to ensure that things go well, and we won't have a problem. Essentially, here are some rails and guidelines so that you don't end up becoming a symbol for reasons to kill us. Naturally, this included a lot of rules about loyalty to your lord and how to treat women, which were mostly just, she is a prize, but please don't kill her. Chivalry was not the thing we think of nowadays because it is definitely twisted. But the very nature of it means war in the past was brutal. One may think of, for example, World War II and the bombing runs and campaigns done by all sides in it. It wasn't just the Nazis or the Soviets or the Japanese, it was everyone. For example, there was a famous bombing in Dresden which caught a lot of attention due to the sheer casualty rate it caused. I'm not here to defend it or attack it. It's freaking war, what can you do? Similarly, the firebombing campaign on Japan was an effort to essentially attack the Japanese mainland by the United States in the hopes that doing so would get them to surrender, considering their tendency was to do the exact opposite. In fact, if you look at the rates of surrendering, the Japanese were one of, if not the lowest throughout the entire war, making the idea of them just surrendering because some side achieved some military victory basically laughable. In fact, as a weird side, did you know that the emperor was almost overthrown and there were plans from the military to overthrow the emperor to keep fighting even after the second atomic bomb? That is how much the Japanese military wanted to keep the fight going. They were very passionate about just keeping the fight up, even if it meant destroying their entire nation. But if we go further back, we see things even more severe. For example, raiding, pillaging, cities were burned to the ground. I know this is going far back, but to put it into perspective, the city of Babylon, I think it was Babylon, it might have been another place in modern day Iraq, however, the golden age of Islam, oh no, it was Baghdad, sorry. I was messing it up because Babylon was also destroyed. When the Mongols invaded the Middle East, they went to Iraq, specifically the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and razed Baghdad to the ground. A learning center, a massive metropolitan hub, was razed and wiped off the face of the planet. And this was the 1300s. Keep in mind, sorry, not 1300s, 1200s. Keep in mind, we had already gone through several thousand years on this planet, and people were still razing entire cities to the ground. Frankly, even for what we can say about the world wars and their brutality in the 1900s, most cities that went through the war are still standing today. Even Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They still exist, and people still know of them. People didn't know where Baghdad was for the longest time because they were trying to find the ruins. Because the Mongols left it in ash. Well, and a bit of concrete, but that's the point. War was brutal in the past, so when people say, like, oh, how dare people in the past do this or that as part of war, it's worth noting everyone was doing that. For example, people complain during the American Revolution about Washington burning Iroquois villages. Fun fact, the Iroquois did that regularly to Americans as well. In fact, that was a common practice during warfare at the time, especially in the Americas, because it was a war of settlements, of settlers. You don't want people encroaching on your land, and they don't want people encroaching on theirs. So if you're at war and you have overlapping claims on who should live where, burning down the settlements of those you deem not supposed to be there is par for the freaking course because you're trying to kick them out. The Iroquois said, this is our land, you leave, we'll burn your villages if you don't. Meanwhile, Americans said, this is our land, you shouldn't be here, so we're gonna kick you out and burn your villages if you didn't. Or you complied and then got Jacksoned. Both happened. But that's the thing. What a lot of people think of as cruelty by one side or the other is really just standard practice being done by the victors. To give another example, what would be a good one? Oh yes, burning Indian villages. Now I adjust this a bit with the Washington point, but this happened throughout the colonial period, so I'm gonna go into it a bit more in depth. A lot of people complain about how it was common for Europeans to burn down villages of Indian tribes. Here's the thing. That was common practice even in Europe. For example, chevauchée, and I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I'm not going to try to spell it because my French sucks, was a practice where light horsemen would go into an enemy territory and burn down villages and farmlands in an attempt to basically scorch the earth. As a result, it was very, very effective at basically damaging supply. The 100 Years' War between Britain and France saw a lot of this go on, and there was a great chevauchée coming from Aquitaine by the English into French territory. So what we look at as a cruel thing now was basically standard military doctrine at the time. You don't like an enemy? Okay. Burn down his crops, destroy his villages, force him to retreat because of lack of supply, and then you can move in. Because this was a settler war, that also encouraged things like it. Because again, I don't want your people here, so we're going to kick you out. And it's not like any one side was above this. Using the Iroquois as an example again, because they are one of the pinnacles of it. During the Beaver Wars, and several other wars the Iroquois engaged in, they would regularly destroy other native villages and seize control of territory for things like fur rights so they could trade, or just because they needed more people, so they would kidnap children and say, yep, we got people now, we can train them to fight, and now you have soldiers. I believe they were called Morning Wars, but I could be misremembering, so apologies on that one. However, again, the point is, it's not like one side's above it. Truthfully, if you can find a side in war that's above doing whatever it takes to win, you've already won the lottery. Because it is very rare for a nation at war to react in a restrained manner. When war happens, most countries and the nations that they control go into a very, very aggressive mindset because their goal is to win the war. For example, Britain blockaded Germany during World War I and starved out hundreds of thousands of people and caused mass starvation across the Central Powers. The fact is, they killed civilians far more than the U-boats ever could. Do you think it's right? It doesn't matter if it did, because they did it, and the reason why is simple. It's war. If people kept going, then that would mean more people fighting their men and meaning more people dying on their side. It's not a hard equation to calculate, and why they did it makes sense. Do I defend it? Not really, no. I just find it hypocritical when people complain about the U-boats but ignore the British blockade. The fact is, war is not pageantry. nor should it be treated as such. War is war. Brutality comes with it, fear comes with it, and bloodshed. The question is, how do you end it? Generally speaking, you can't end it by being kind and friendly and chivalrous. You end it by being so freaking ruthless that the enemy is put on the back foot and their capital surrounded within weeks. Because guess what? The longer a war goes on, the more people end up being buried. So ending it quickly is often the best choice. So you may not like it, but that's reality. And so, for a long time, war was built around basically brutal but effective tactics to force an enemy into a quick surrender. Scorched earth tactics were regularly used to starve out the enemy and deprive them of food, by burning what crops the army couldn't carry and often poisoning the wells alongside it so they couldn't get drinking water. Simultaneously, other tactics such as strategic retreats, raiding, destruction of property, complete destruction of entire civilizations and their cities and other settled areas was also common. It's only in the 1800s that we really saw anyone saying, hey, maybe, just maybe, we should have some standards to this whole thing. And it wasn't even the early 1800s, it was mid to late 1800s by the time people started the Geneva Convention. And that was largely because warfare continued its brutality, both in Crimea but also in Italy, as the Italian unification wars were not exactly pretty. And so the Geneva Conventions were proposed and signed, and then they had to keep adding them because people would always find ways around it. Because a little known fact about humanity, they can be freaking brutal and creative when you give them the opportunity to. Poison gas was not initially part of people's military strategies. Then people invented it, and oh boy, did they use it. And so, and actually speaking, war has somewhat dulled in terms of brutality. Now, is that saying it's still it's not a freak? That's not to say that it's an honorable thing anymore. It's not. It's just a thing that exists. However, it's far more restrained. Far, far more than it used to be. Going all the way back to initial hunter-gatherer civilizations, people were wiped off the map. Cultures were annihilated. That was par and parcel for the course. Then slavery became a thing so they didn't have to kill everyone and could actually have an increased labor pool. Look at what Rome did to the Gauls and recognize that was standard for most of the ancient world. Very rarely did you have someone like the Persians or Alexander's empire where they showed mercy. And even then, Alexander was not a merciful person if you got in his way. He sold an entire population into slavery because that city they lived in resisted for too long. The Gallic Wars, for as extreme as they were, even at the time, were standard fare. It's just that they drew on for so long that the casualty rates really mounted. The Romans basically wiped out the Gallic peoples in Iberia and France. Now, was there still some remnants? Yes. In fact, if you look at certain groups, like, for example, Galicians or Britons, in reference to Brittany, you can still find a bit of Celtic influence. However, the amount of destruction the Romans did was massive. Similarly, the Slavs engaged in regular things as well when they were first spreading out. So too did the Arabs, my lord, and plenty of other groups as well. The fact is, in the past, there were very few gloves that were on when it came to warfare. In fact, selling an entire people into slavery was pretty standard for antiquity, and later on, once you get to the Middle Ages, it was not uncommon to, upon capturing a city or a people, say, either convert or we kill you. In fact, Muslim and Christian armies regularly did this, especially during the Crusades. Muslims would capture Christians and say, alright, convert or die, and then Christians would come over and capture people and say, convert or die. That was standard throughout most of human history. Brutality is nothing new in warfare. What I find a joke is people saying, no, then we shouldn't engage in it at all. Because people will engage in the more brutal sides of warfare. For example, this is the past. I didn't say how long ago. Who knows of Iran and Iraq? Or, more accurately, Persia and Mesopotamia. I say more accurately, that's really just the areas they existed in the past. We used to call the area Persia, that is now Iran, because that's what the Iranians called themselves. And Mesopotamia is the main region Iraq is made up of. Well, during the Iran-Iraq War, there was a clash between the Ayatollah, the religious government of Iran, with Saddam Hussein. So do you know what Hussein did? Hussein used gas on people and his own civilians. He would gas enemy soldiers and his own people to end the war. He cared not for civilian casualties, and he certainly didn't care about the enemy, which resulted in a status quo antebellum. The brutality people can demonstrate, even in the modern era and time periods people have been alive for, is far. Also, I just realized I spelled Sudan. Hussein, there it is. Jeez, I'm an idiot. But the brutality people demonstrate, even now, is freaking insane, especially in the third world where there are a lot less compunctions about being brutal during warfare. So the idea that a lot of people have of, oh, this is so brutal, why don't we just not do it? Not everyone believes the same as you. In fact, there are plenty of people who would gladly see you get massacred if you got in their way. So we can't just ignore the brutality of people in the past, because people now will still do similar levels of it, especially if they're in a society which has not reached a point yet where they view warfare as bad as we do now, especially in the First World. Because you have to remember, World War I and World War II really characterized the views of the West on warfare. The brutality of the trenches, followed by the sheer destruction caused by Blitzkrieg and the response to it, resulted in a lot of people being very uncomfortable with the idea of going to war. This was later compounded by the news often taking anti-war stances in both Korea and Vietnam, though Vietnam was to a much greater extent, because they would regularly report and record dead bodies. This is despite the fact that Korea had a larger casualty count than Vietnam, but details. But regardless, the West, in terms of how it thinks about war, is far more against it than most places in the world, because most places in the world still see its effectiveness. For example, Saudi Arabia only exists because the House of Saud in Najd conquered Medina and Mecca. The only reason they hold the holy cities is because they conquered it. Riyadh would not be holding it otherwise. Similarly, Iraq wouldn't exist without war. Same with Syria, because let's face it, those two basically only exist to fight each other and themselves. And basically everyone else. Honestly, those two kind of fight everyone. African tribes, same story. Mozambique and Angola would not be free without warfare. Neither would most places in Asia. And then, of course, there's China and Japan, who have long histories of military conflict. Fact is, most societies do not look on war as horribly as we do. Japan is probably one of the few exceptions, and Korea as well. But others, not really. Because, plain and simply, they're either too focused on the wills of their despots, or they still see war as something they could potentially gain out of, especially if they're tribalists. So when we look at how warfare was conducted in the past, we need to remember, warfare in the past was brutal. And even now, war is brutal. We shouldn't kid around that and pretend like we can somehow be moral while fighting a war. It's war. The most moral thing to do is end it with the least casualties possible, and that's done by being quick, efficient, and brutal. Get in, conquer, get done. Simple. So we should not be acting as idiots, pretending as if, oh, war is somehow, something so bad that we should avoid altogether. Because war is likely going to come regardless, and we need to be prepared for it. And at the same time, there's the other head of the coin where we shouldn't be jumping into war like it's some game. This is not Hearts of Iron. You're not guiding some fake chess pieces on a board. Real lives are at stake. So we need to take stock of our situation, recognize war can bring a lot of suffering. In fact, it's almost guaranteed to. But it can bring a lot of good as well. Stopping Nazis was a good thing. Stopping commies was a good thing. Because starvation and massacres are not good things, and that is their policy. And so, we have to first recognize war ain't pretty, it never will be, but we must be ready to, like our ancestors, be ready to pull the trigger at any moment. Anyways, that's the first video. Hope you enjoyed.